"You don't have a disability we recognize." That's what the HOA president said to my face 3 weeks after my spinal surgery, while I stood in her doorway holding a cane in one hand and a stack of medical records in the other. My name is Melissa Grant, and 11 months ago I could still run the Riverbend 5K every spring with my husband Tom. We'd lived in Willow Creek Estates for 6 years, a quiet cul-de-sac community of beige stucco houses, manicured hedges, and a homeowners association that mostly stayed out of our lives. I knew our HOA president, Diane Kessler, the way you know a neighbor you wave to but never really talk to. She drove a white Lexus SUV with a Willow Creek board member parking placard she'd made herself, and she took her volunteer position more seriously than most people take their actual jobs. Willow Creek had 42 units, a shared clubhouse, a community pool that closed every year on Labor Day whether the weather cooperated or not, and one of those HOA boards that loved sending letters about grass height and holiday lights left up past January 15th. Nobody loved Diane exactly, but nobody fought her either. She'd been president for 9 years, re-elected every single time by the same 12 or 13 homeowners who actually bothered showing up to the annual meeting. Everyone else just wanted to avoid the letters. Homeowners joked that crossing her was like crossing a small, aggressive dog, technically harmless, but exhausting to deal with, and always leaving a mark somewhere you didn't expect. Tom worked long shifts as a paramedic, which meant plenty of nights it was just me and our 2 cats in that house, comfortable in a routine that felt in hindsight almost embarrassingly ordinary. Grocery runs on Sundays, walks around the cul-de-sac at dusk. The kind of life where the biggest weekly drama was whether the mail carrier remembered to close the cluster box properly. I liked our life. I wasn't looking for a fight with anyone, least of all a woman who signed her emails, Diane Kessler, HOA president, in a font size 2 sizes larger than her actual message. Then in March, I fell off a ladder cleaning our gutters. 2 herniated discs and a fractured vertebra later, I came home from the hospital in a back brace, using a walker for the first 6 weeks and a cane after that. My spot in our driveway was fine, except our unit was the second to last one on a curved private street, almost 90 feet from the visitor parking and 140 feet from the clubhouse mailbox cluster, where I had to check our mail every single day. My orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Anissa Rahman, was blunt about it. You need a designated accessible spot closer to your door, at minimum through your recovery, possibly permanently depending on how the fusion heals. She wrote it down, she signed it, she dated it April 2nd. I didn't think this would be complicated. Federal and state fair housing laws require HOAs to grant reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. That's not an opinion, it's the law, and I'd looked it up the same afternoon Dr. Rahman handed me the letter. All I needed was one reserved space, maybe 15 feet closer to my unit, with a small accessibility sign. I filled out Willow Creek's official accommodation request form, attached the doctor's letter, my surgical discharge paperwork, and a photo of the exact stretch of curb I meant. I submitted it on April 4th, hand-delivered to the HOA drop box outside the clubhouse, and I even emailed a scanned copy to Diane directly with a read receipt turned on. 9 days later, I got my answer. 1 sentence, no letterhead, sent from Diane's personal email at 11:47 p.m. Request denied. Please see board bylaws regarding parking modifications. That was it. No explanation, no mention of the medical documentation, no acknowledgement that I'd even attached anything. I called the HOA office line the next morning, a Tuesday at 9:04 a.m. I remember because I wrote it in the notebook I'd started keeping by the coffee maker, a habit Renata would later thank me for more than once. The property manager, a soft-spoken man named Curtis who mostly handled landscaping invoices and pool maintenance schedules, sounded uncomfortable the moment I mentioned the accommodation form. Diane handled that one personally, he said, his voice dropping like he didn't want anyone else in the office to hear. The board didn't actually vote on it as a group. She said she'd deal with it herself since it was a sensitive matter. A sensitive matter, I repeated. It's a doctor's note. I know, Curtis said. I'm just telling you what she told me. That single sentence should have told me everything. I emailed Deanne again, this time CCing the 2 other listed board members, attaching the same documentation a second time and asking in writing for the specific bylaw section cited in her denial. 4 days passed. Then I got a letter, an actual printed letter this time, taped to my front door instead of mailed, informing me that unauthorized signage or curb modifications would result in a $150 per week violation fine, retroactive to the date I'd submitted my unapproved proposal. I hadn't installed anything. I hadn't painted a curb or planted a sign in the ground. I had submitted a request. Diane was fining me for asking. I stood on my porch reading that letter twice, then a third time, my hands shaking and not from the nerve damage. Tom came home to find me sitting on the front steps, still holding it. She's fining us, I told him, for filing paperwork. That night we talked about just letting it go, parking somewhere further away, timing our trips to the mailbox, avoiding the whole fight. I was still 6 weeks post-op. I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with distance. But something about that letter, the casual cruelty of it, the confidence that I'd simply absorb the cost and the humiliation, settled into my chest and stayed there. The next morning I drove myself slowly, cane against the driver's seat, to the county recorder's office and pulled Willow Creek's full governing documents. Not the summary packet homeowners get at closing, the actual recorded CC and RS and bylaws, 41 pages, filed with the county in 2011. I read every word about parking. There was no bylaw prohibiting accessible parking requests. There wasn't even a section addressing them at all. Diane had cited a rule that didn't exist. I photographed the relevant pages and sent them to Diane with a single line, "Please cite the specific section you referenced in your April 13th denial." I copied the board again. I copied Curtis. This time, nobody replied for 11 days. On day 12, a second letter appeared on my door. The fine had grown to $600 and now included a new claim that my continued noncompliance constituted a pattern of disruptive behavior that the board would be reviewing at its next quarterly meeting, with possible further action. Tom read it standing in the kitchen, and I watched his jaw tighten in a way I'd only seen twice in 12 years of marriage. "They're threatening to escalate," he said, "because you asked for a parking spot." 2 days later, our next-door neighbor, Priya, knocked on our door holding a casserole dish and an expression I couldn't quite place. "I heard what's happening," she said, sitting at our kitchen table. "Diane did something similar to the Hendersons 2 summers ago over a wheelchair ramp on their porch. They just stopped fighting, moved out 18 months later." She looked at me carefully. "I don't think you should stop fighting." That conversation stayed with me longer than the fine did. It meant this wasn't new behavior. It meant somebody else had already quietly given up, and Diane had learned that giving up was the most likely outcome. That's when I stopped treating this like a neighborhood disagreement and started treating it like a legal problem. I called the state's Fair Housing Division the following Monday morning and described everything chronologically with dates. The intake specialist, a woman named Patricia, stopped me halfway through. "You have documentation showing they denied a reasonable accommodation request, then fined you for making it?" she asked. "That's not a gray area. That's a textbook violation of the Fair Housing Act." HOAs are legally required to engage in what's called an interactive process with any accommodation request. They can ask clarifying questions, they can request additional documentation, but they cannot simply deny it without basis, and they absolutely cannot retaliate against you for submitting one. Patricia walked me through the next steps. I could file a formal fair housing complaint, which would trigger a state investigation into Willow Creek's HOA, though she was honest that investigations could take months, sometimes longer. I could also, separately, send the board a certified cease and desist letter citing the specific statute, which sometimes resolved things faster than waiting on a government timeline, especially once an HOA's insurance carrier got involved and started asking its own uncomfortable questions. Boards are usually more scared of their insurance premiums going up than they are of a lawsuit itself, Patricia said. "Use both levers if you can afford to." I decided to do both, and I filed the state complaint that same afternoon, uploading every email, every letter, every photograph, time-stamped and organized exactly the way she'd walked me through. I hired an attorney, Renata Ibarra, who specialized in disability and housing law, for a flat consultation fee. She read my documents in 11 minutes and looked up at me over her glasses. "This is one of the cleanest cases I've seen in a while," she said. "They gave you a paper trail proving their own violation. All we have to do is hand it back to them." Renata drafted a letter that cited the Fair Housing Act, our state's parallel accessibility statute, and Willow Creek's own recorded governing documents, the ones that contain no parking modification restriction whatsoever. It demanded the accommodation be approved within 10 business days, all fines rescinded and refunded, and written confirmation that no further retaliatory action would be taken. It was sent certified mail, with a copy filed simultaneously with the State Fair Housing Division as part of my open complaint. It arrived at the HOA's registered address on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, Curtis called me, and for the first time he didn't sound uncomfortable. He sounded rattled. "The board's attorney got involved," he said. "There's an emergency meeting Monday night. Diane wants you there." I almost didn't go. Part of me wanted Renata to handle it entirely on paper, no more direct contact with Diane at all, but Renata thought differently. Go, she said. Boards move fast when they think a camera is watching and a lawsuit's coming. Let them watch you walk in with your cane and your documents, and let them explain themselves to your face for once. So I went. The clubhouse meeting room held maybe 30 folding chairs, and every one of them was full that Monday night homeowners who'd apparently heard rumors, and one man in a gray suit sitting beside Diane who I correctly guessed was the board's attorney. Diane's face when I walked in with Tom and a folder of documents went through 3 visible stages: irritation, recognition, and something close to panic. The attorney spoke first before Diane could say a word. We've reviewed the complaint filed with the state, he said, along with the correspondence provided by Ms. Grant's counsel. It's the board's position that this matter should be resolved immediately tonight to avoid further exposure. Diane's mouth opened. The bylaws are meant to preserve, Diane. The attorney didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There is no bylaw provision governing accessible parking accommodations. You denied a documented disability request without basis and then issued retaliatory fines. That is a federal violation, not an aesthetic preference. He turned to me. Ms. Grant, the board is prepared to approve your accommodation tonight, rescind all fines with a written refund confirmation, and install the accessibility signage at the HOA's expense within 5 business days. I felt Tom's hand find mine under the folder in my lap. Diane tried once more. I just think if we make an exception for one homeowner, it's not an exception, Renata said, standing beside me for the first time that night. It's a legal obligation. This isn't a request the board gets to grant as a favor. It's a request the board was required to grant in April. The room had gone completely silent except for the hum of the clubhouse air conditioner. A homeowner near the back, a man I recognized vaguely from block parties, muttered, "How long has she been doing this to people?" Another woman older raised her hand and said quietly that she'd had her own accommodation request, misplaced, 2 years earlier and had simply given up. Diane's face went pale, then flushed red, the way skin does right before someone realizes there's no version of the next sentence that helps them. I was protecting the aesthetic standards this community voted on, Diane said, quieter now, almost to herself. Nobody voted on denying a disability accommodation, the older woman shot back. I was at that annual meeting. That was never on any agenda. Curtis, sitting near the door with a laptop open, didn't look up from his notes, but I saw his shoulders relax half an inch, the posture of a man who'd spent 9 years biting his tongue and was finally allowed to stop. The board voted 7-1 that night. Diane cast the single no vote. Then 30 seconds later, under the visible pressure of her own attorney's stare, she changed it to an abstention instead, which the secretary recorded without comment. The appeal that had taken 9 days to deny took less than 4 minutes to reverse. Within a week, the sign was installed, a small blue and white accessibility placard, planted exactly where I'd photographed it back in April, 15 feet from my front door. The $600 in fines was refunded to our account with an itemized letter of apology from the HOA's management company, not from Diane. Curtis told me later that the board's insurance carrier had gotten involved once the fair housing complaint was formally opened, and that a loan had done more to move things than any letter I'd sent. 3 months later, at the HOA's annual meeting, Diane didn't run for another term. Nobody announced why. Nobody had to. You could feel it in the room, that particular quiet that settles over a community once everyone quietly agrees a chapter is closing. The new board president, a soft-spoken retired teacher named Barbara, sent out an email within her first month reminding all homeowners that accommodation requests would now go through a documented 3-person review process, in full compliance with fair housing law, with a response deadline of 15 business days written directly into the updated bylaws. Priya told me a month later that the Hendersons, the couple who'd given up on their wheelchair ramp 2 summers earlier and moved away, had reached out to Barbara after hearing what happened. The board sent them a written apology too, even though they no longer lived in Willow Creek. It didn't undo the 18 months they'd spent fighting alone or the decision they'd made to leave rather than keep fighting, but it was something. Barbara told me later that she considered that letter one of the first things she was proud to have signed as president. Curtis stayed on with the new board. He told me months afterward, over a coffee run that had nothing to do with HOA business at all, that he'd wanted to say something to me back in April, the very first week. But he was scared of what Diane would do to his contract if he did. I should have, he said. I told him he didn't owe me an apology. He told me the truth the second I actually asked for it, and that mattered more than most people ever managed. I still park in that spot every day. Some mornings I stand there for a second longer than I need to looking at that little blue sign. Remembering the version of myself that almost didn't fight for it, the one who was ready to just park farther away and swallow the exhaustion because it felt easier than confrontation. It wasn't a huge system I had to beat. It was one woman who assumed a disabled homeowner with a cane wouldn't know the law, wouldn't hire a lawyer, wouldn't show up to a meeting she wasn't required to attend. She was wrong about all three. And I think that miscalculation is the part of this story that stays with me the most. Not the fine, not the letters, but the quiet assumption baked into every single one of them that I'd simply absorb it and move on the way the Hendersons had. I think about that a lot now, especially on the mornings when my back aches enough that I feel every one of those 90 extra feet I used to have to walk. Recovery wasn't instant just because the parking spot was resolved. The fusion still took months to fully heal, and some days it still reminds me it's there. But I don't have to choose between resting and getting my mail anymore. And I don't have to plan my entire day around a distance that never should have been forced on me in the first place. If you've ever been denied something you were legally owed by a board that thought you wouldn't push back, I hope this story is the reminder you needed. Document everything, know your rights, and don't let anyone convince you that asking for what you're owed is somehow the disruptive act. The disruption was never the request. It was always the denial. If this story hit home for you, or if you've got your own HOA battle worth telling, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want more stories like this, you know what to do.